for people to come on in here and admitting people. So if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, that would be good. While we do that, for people to come on in here. Good. Okay. So we're going to be live on YouTube, and we're going to be recording this and then disseminating it. So I know our speaker doesn't have a camera on, but if you wanted to participate in the question and answer time, it would be great if you turn your camera on so that we can get you on the recording. Otherwise, you're free to do whatever you would like. And all right. All right. So let's go ahead and get started here. My name is Rich Procida. I'm the founder of the Truth and Democracy Coalition. And what I want to do now, we're going to have a presentation by Professor Joseph Dowd on philosophical therapy for political activists. And but first, I want to tell you a little bit about the Truth and Democracy Coalition, and then tell you about some of our upcoming events. So the Truth and Democracy Coalition was formed, and let me do this first. Here, hold on a second. Here we go. All right. So the Truth and Democracy Coalition was formed to build a pro-democracy movement in America. We educate the public about disinformation, teach people to be critical of the propaganda they consume, and provide critical analysis of current events and social issues. We produce media, educational materials, hold seminars and meetings, work with other organizations, organize events and activity, all geared toward building a pro-democracy movement in America. And the coalition seeks to build communities of people of different faiths and ideologies to defend and promote democracy locally, nationally, and globally. On July 16th at 2 p.m., which is next Sunday, we're going to have our first January 6th Remembrance Event Planning Committee meeting. We put an annual event on here in Whittier, California, in which we raise awareness about what happened on Jan 6, 2021, so that we can keep that in the forefront of people's minds. So we're planning our annual event to remember the attempted coup and the insurrection against the United States Congress. And it's important to remember what happened and to not let the actions of then President Donald Trump and his extremist followers overthrow our government and install Donald Trump as dictator for life. So in order to resist authoritarianism, we must keep the events of January 6th, 2021 at the forefront of people's minds as we head into the 2024 elections, with Donald Trump still the front runner for the Republican nomination, even now. So we're organizing an event in Whittier. We're going to help people organize events in their hometown. So join us on July 16th at 2 p.m. by registering at tinyurl.com/Jan6, 2024. Then on Sunday, August 6th at 2 p.m., my name, Richard Procida. I'm an author, attorney. I wrote a book on global perspectives on social issues about pornography. I'm the leader of the Truth and Democracy Coalition. I'm going to lead a discussion about women, relationships, politics, and life. And we do this on a monthly basis. And this will be our third nonpartisan Red Pill men's group. And women are welcome to attend too, and they do attend. And at this meeting, we're going to begin our book study of The Rational Male by Rollo Tomassi. And we're beginning with the first section of the book, the basics. So to register for that, go to tinyurl.com/redpillmen. And then check out our discussion about what's wrong with men, or part one of that discussion at least. I'm going to be putting out the whole thing in its entirety, the whole hour and a half, but you can check out the first part of that presentation at our YouTube page, and you can get that at youtube.com/@Truth and Democracy Coalition. And when you go there, remember to like, share, and subscribe to our page. So today we have Professor Joseph Dowd, a philosophy instructor at California State University, San Bernardino, and he's going to teach us logic-based therapy and address the need for progressives to reclaim self-improvement. Dr. Dowd is licensed by the National Philosophical Counseling Association as a philosophical consultant. He's a professor of philosophy at Cal State University, San Bernardino. And as a philosophical consultant, what that is basically a therapist who uses philosophical reasoning to address emotional problems. And in this presentation, he's going to explain logic-based therapy and how you can use it in your own life. So it's this LBT, logic-based therapy, is especially useful for people who are involved in politics. It helps to diffuse anger, defensiveness, and other emotions that can cause the political dialogue to degenerate into a shouting match. And with its focus, he's also focused on Asian philosophy, and he's concerned that many left-wing intellectuals have turned against the self-help and wellness industries. So left-wing intellectuals, they make good points when they criticize self-help and awareness and the prosperity gospel and so forth. However, by abandoning self-help and wellness, the left creates a void that's being filled by right-wing intellectuals like Jordan Peterson. And a lot of what we're doing here is to sort of fill those voids so that people don't turn to authoritarianism and don't turn to conservative intellectuals. If we leave this opening, this void is what Professor Dowd calls it. And maybe you can talk a little more about that. But I'd like to introduce Professor Joseph Dowd. Welcome, Joseph.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Rich. So do you think I should just get started now with the presentation?
Yeah, go ahead, just get started. And there you go. And
okay, everyone. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the meeting. Thanks for coming to see me speak. Rich, can you see my screen share? All right.
I can see it. I can see it.
Okay. Okay, well, let me just get started then. I'm going to lay my cards on the table. Politically, I'm a leftist. I know that not all of you would describe yourselves as leftists, but I hope that this presentation can be helpful for everyone, regardless of political leanings. First, let me explain why I'm giving this presentation. The 1960s hippie counterculture embraced Asian and New Age spiritual ideas. Meanwhile, conservative Christians rejected those ideas. A lot of today's self-help and, quote, wellness, unquote, culture developed from those ideas. As a result, self-help and wellness used to be dominated by left-leaning or at least liberal people. Now, on the popular level, that's still true today. If you visit a New Age bookstore or a meditation retreat, you're more likely to encounter Democrats than Republicans. But among intellectuals, it's a different story. I mean, when's the last time you heard a left-wing intellectual talk about the importance of self-improvement and building character and self-discovery and slaying your dragons and all that stuff? When's the last time you heard a left-wing intellectual talk about that? In fact, many left-wing intellectuals have turned against the self-help and wellness industries. For example, many left-wing intellectuals have criticized the Western meditation industry. This industry teaches people to use Buddhist-style meditation to reduce stress. Now, it isn't hard to see why politically aware people might have a problem with this. By its very nature, this approach shifts responsibility away from the system and onto the individual. If you're stressed out from work, it isn't the system's fault, it's your fault for not meditating enough. Left-wing intellectuals want to change the system, so they criticize the meditation industry for shifting attention away from the system. I think that left-wing intellectuals make good points when they criticize the self-help and wellness industries. However, by abandoning self-help and wellness, the left creates a void that's being filled by right-wing intellectuals. One example is the conservative psychologist Jordan Peterson. Some of you have probably heard of him. His self-help advice and spiritual philosophy have helped many young men. These young men have become his followers. Over time, Peterson has become increasingly right-wing. So many of his followers have fallen down the alt-right rabbit hole. Here's the thing. People, especially, I think, young men, need self-help and wellness. They need something to help them explore their inner worlds and navigate their struggles. And they need more than just ordinary therapy talk. They need a robust philosophy of self-improvement and something that we might even call spirituality. If they don't get that on the left, then they'll turn to the right. Now, I don't have a complete self-improvement plan or spiritual philosophy to share, but I do have a tool that might help you take a first step toward a journey of self-improvement. I'm licensed by the National Philosophical Counseling Association as a philosophical consultant. As Rich said, a philosophical consultant is basically a therapist who uses philosophical reasoning to address emotional problems. To be clear, I'm not a medical doctor and I'm not qualified to treat psychiatric disorders. To receive my certification, I was trained in something called logic-based therapy, or LBT. In this presentation, I'll explain LBT and how you can use it in your own life without needing to visit a philosophical consultant like me. I think that LBT is especially useful for people interested in politics. LBT helps to diffuse anger, defensiveness, and other emotions that can get in the way of political dialogue. Okay, now I'm going to start going over how LBT works. There's a whole kind of theory behind LBT. So we need to get into the theory a bit in order to understand LBT. Okay, so first of all, LBT rests on a certain theory about the structure of emotions. According to LBT, for each emotion, there's an object of the emotion. That is whatever the emotion is about or directed at. So if you're angry, the object is what you're angry at. Or if you're sad, the object is what you're sad about. Okay. And the emotion consists of that object plus a reaction. I'm going to label the object O and the reaction R. Okay, so here are just some examples. If the emotion is anger, then the object O is going to be some action that someone did. And the reaction R is going to be condemnation of the action or of the person who performed the action. If the emotion is guilt, then the object is a moral rule that one thinks one has violated. Okay? And the reaction is condemnation of oneself. Okay? If the emotion is depression, the object is an event or situation, presumably a bad one, and the reaction is a bleak perception of one's own existence. Let's put it that way. Okay, now these are just a few emotions. Obviously these are many more, but I'm just giving you an example of the structure of emotions. Okay. Now, again, if the emotion is depression, then the object is some event or situation. So, for example, let's say you have some middle school student who is depressed. And let's say that they're depressed because they think that all their peers hate them. Okay, so the object in this case is all my peers hate me. And the reaction is going to be a bleak perception of one's own existence. So let's say that this kid thinks that they're worthless. So the reaction is, I am worthless. So in this case, the depression consists of the object, all my peers hate me, and the reaction, I am worthless. Okay. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now here are the 6 steps of LBT. These are the 6 steps that a philosophical consultant like me would apply when helping a client. But there's really no reason why you can't apply these 6 steps to yourself. I mean, you don't really need to visit a philosophical consultant to use these 6 steps. The first step is identify your emotional reasoning. Well, I'll explain what that means in a moment. Then you identify a fallacy. That is some mistake that you're making in your emotional reasoning. The third step is to refute the faulty step in your reasoning. Okay, so once you identify a fallacy, that will tell you that there's a problem with one of the steps in your emotional reasoning. And so then you want to, in your own mind, refute that step. In other words, come up with some example or some evidence that disproves that step in your reasoning. Then you're going to identify a guiding virtue. This is some virtue that can help you to avoid that kind of faulty reasoning that you were committing. Fifth, you want to adopt a philosophy that promotes that virtue. And sixth, you make a plan of action to kind of put that philosophy into action. Okay, so that's just a very quick summary of the 6 steps. Now let's go into them in some more detail. Again, the first step is to identify your emotional reasoning. Now, again, according to LBT, an emotion consists of an object and a reaction. And the emotional reasoning behind an emotion has the following structure. You've got a rule, a report, and a conclusion. The rule is if O, then R. Remember, O is the object, R is the reaction. So it's important, before you identify your emotional reasoning, you have to figure out what emotion you're struggling with and figure out what the object of that emotion is and what the reaction you're having to that emotion, to that object is. And so once you figure out the object and the reaction, you can figure out the rule. The rule is if O, then R. The report is O, and the conclusion is therefore R. Now that is probably a bit abstract, but an example will clarify what I mean. Okay, so let's go back to our depressed middle schooler. They think all their peers hate them, and as a result, they feel that they're worthless. Okay, so again, the rule is if object, then reaction. The object is all my peers hate me. So the rule is if all my peers hate me, then the reaction is I am worthless. Then I am worthless. If all my peers hate me, then I am worthless. That's the rule. That's kind of in the back of their mind. And then there's the report. The report is just object. In this case, the object is all my peers hate me. So the report is all my peers hate me. Okay, so if you put the rule and the report together, you get if all my peers hate me, then I am worthless. All my peers hate me. And obviously, then we get the conclusion, therefore, I am worthless. Okay, Hopefully, that makes sense. If you have any questions about this, obviously we can go back to it during the question and answer period. Okay, so that's just an example of identifying your emotional reasoning. Now, the idea here is not that you necessarily have these steps all explicitly worked out in your mind when you're feeling an emotion. No, it's just that this is what's kind of lies behind your emotion, right? And you want to kind of bring it out so that you can examine it. Okay, now the second step is to identify a fallacy in your emotional reasoning. Now remember, the emotional reasoning involves a rule and a report and a conclusion. Okay, now some fallacies have to do with rules. Now here I've listed various fallacies that are kind of recognized within the field of LBT. These aren't necessarily the only mistakes that people could make in their emotional reasoning, but they're some of the most common. So demanding perfection is when you have a rule that basically says, if anything is imperfect, then like life is horrible, right? Like I can't stand it, right? If things aren't perfect. Bandwagon reasoning is when you have a rule that says something like, if everyone thinks this way, then I should think this way too, right? And you're jumping on the bandwagon. The world revolves around me is when you have a rule that says, well, if I believe this, or I think this way, or I feel this way, then everyone should too. Obviously, that can be a real hazard when you're involved in discussing politics, right? Because it can be very easy to think, well, if I see things this way, then anyone who doesn't see things this way must just be a bad person, right? Awfulizing is when you think, well, if this bad thing happens, then it's the most horrible thing possible, right? You awfulize it. Damnation is when you say, well, if someone does something bad, then they're worthless, or I hate them, right? And you can damn others, you can damn yourself. You can even damn the world, right? You might think, well, if these bad things are happening to me, well, then this world is just awful, right? That's also a form of damnation. Dutiful worrying is when you think, well, if there's this problem or potential danger, then I must worry about it, right? Even if you're not really doing any good by worrying. Okay, so those are just some fallacies. There are also fallacies of reporting, like oversimplifying reality or distorting probabilities or blind conjecture. That's when you just guess, right? Without sufficient evidence. Okay. These have to do with the report in your logical reasoning, in your emotional reasoning. Okay. So now let's give an example of identifying a fallacy. So we go back to our emotional reasoning. If all my peers hate me, then I am worthless. All my peers hate me, therefore I am worthless. Okay, so there are actually a few fallacies that this rule is committing. One is bandwagon reasoning, because the person is thinking, well, if all my peers think I'm worthless, then I should think that too, right? I should just jump on the bandwagon, go along with what everyone else is saying. Another fallacy is damnation, right? This person is saying, well, if there are some problems with me, maybe I'm not that popular, I'm not good at making friends, then I damn myself. I must be worthless, right? You could also say that this rule is committing the fallacy of demanding a perfection, that, if my life isn't perfect, right? If, say, I'm not popular, then, my life is just worthless. My life is terrible. Okay. There are also some problems with the report. It's quite likely that this report, all my peers hate me, is oversimplifying reality. It might be that a lot of the person's peers hate them. That doesn't mean all of them do. Saying, well, all of them do, that's probably an oversimplification. That person can probably find some people who like him if he tries. Distorting probabilities. I mean, okay, so maybe like, let's say you're new at school and everyone you've run into has kind of disliked you. Well, if that happens enough time, you might conclude, well, obviously everyone must hate me. But is it really that likely that everyone hates you? Or are you distorting probabilities there? Okay, so you identify a fallacy in one of these steps, either the rule or the report. Okay. Then the third step is to refute the faulty step in your reasoning. Now, we saw that actually in this case, both the rule and the report are flawed. So here's one way you could refute the rule. The rule says, if all my peers hate me, then I'm worthless. Okay, so I'm not expecting everyone to know about this, but I'm a philosophy instructor. So there was this ancient Greek philosopher named Socrates, and actually everyone in his hometown ended up hating him because he asked all these annoying questions. In fact, they hated him so much that they condemned him to death. So everyone hated Socrates, but he wasn't worthless, right? He was actually one of the greatest philosophers who's ever lived. The report is, all my peers hate me. Well, actually, okay, it seemed like everyone hated Socrates, but Socrates had a student named Plato, and Plato liked him. So it's quite likely that even if it seems like everyone hates you, not everyone does. Okay, now obviously I wouldn't expect you to come up with an example involving Socrates, but you can think of your own examples, right, to disprove the faulty steps in your reasoning. Okay, so that's step 3. Step 4 is to identify a guiding virtue. A guiding virtue is some virtue that can help counteract whatever fallacy you're committing. So let's say that you're demanding perfection. Well, the guiding virtue that you should work on is security. That means feeling secure with yourself and with the world, right? So that you are able to embrace the world or yourself, even if you aren't perfect or the world isn't perfect. If your fallacy is damnation, like you damn someone or yourself for doing something bad, well, then the philosophical, the guiding virtue that you should work on is respect for yourself, respect for others. If your fallacy is awfulizing, you tend to, like, whenever something goes wrong, you think it's the most awful thing ever. Well, you need to work on the virtue of courage, and so on. So there are different guiding virtues for different fallacies. If your fallacy is the world revolves around me, right? You think everyone needs to think and feel the way you do. Well, you need to work on empathy. You need to work on seeing things from other people's point of view. If you tend to oversimplify reality, you need to work on being objective, on looking at all the facts instead of oversimplifying. If you tend to make blind guesses, then you need to develop the virtue of empiricism, of looking at factual evidence before coming to conclusion. And if you tend to jump on the bandwagon, then you need to work on the virtue of independence, thinking for yourself. Okay, so for example, let's look at this rule. If all my peers hate me, then I'm worthless. Okay, so we saw that that's committing the fallacy of bandwagon reasoning, and the guiding virtue would be independence. So you should judge yourself based on your own standards rather than others' standards. Right? Don't jump on the bandwagon. This rule is committing the fallacy of damnation. Just because you aren't perfect, you're damning yourself. You're saying you're worthless. Well, you need to work on respect. specifically in this case, respect for yourself. You need to recognize your own inherent value. Okay. Step 5 is to adopt a philosophy that promotes the virtue. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all these different philosophies. There are probably some terms here that you haven't heard of. That's fine. The point is, there are lots of different philosophical theories and viewpoints out there that you can draw upon to support whatever guiding virtue you're working on. And if you don't know much about academic philosophy, that's fine. I mean, you can come up with your own kind of personal philosophy. You know, you don't really have to read any books to come up with a philosophy to promote your guiding virtue. And finally, step 6, make a plan of action to put that philosophy into practice. Okay, so in this case, one philosophy that the person might use is Stoicism. Because remember, they were demanding perfection. They thought, well, if I'm not perfect, then I must be worthless. And one way to counteract demanding perfection is an ancient Greek and Roman philosophy called Stoicism. Stoicism focuses on separating what you can control from what you can't. And then the idea is to only worry about or only focus on the things you can control. So, for example, if you're playing a game, don't worry about whether you'll win. Just worry about what you can control, which is the effort that you put in. And as long as you do your best, as long as you put in the effort, you know, you should feel good about yourself. Okay, so that's the idea behind Stoicism. Focus only on the things you can control and don't worry about everything else. This can help you stop demanding that everything be perfect. Okay. Now, some possible plans to put this into action is to read about Stoicism. Actually, Stoicism has become kind of trendy in recent years. Like there are popular books about Stoicism, like self-help books about Stoicism. Another way is obviously to practice separating what you can control from what you can't. So in your mind, right? Think about, okay, what are the things that I actually can control and what are the things I can't? Another thing you could do is a fear setting exercise. That's where you kind of make a list. Like, let's say you're trying to make a decision about whether to do something and you're a little nervous. You aren't sure whether you want to do it. Well, make a list of, if I do this, what are all the bad things that might happen? And if I don't do this, what are all the bad things that might happen? And then you look at the lists, and based on that, you can figure out, you know, like what might go wrong and what is within your control, what you might be able to do if things go wrong. And that can help you be in a better position to make a decision. Okay. Now, I should note that you can sometimes skip steps 2 and 4. Okay, so actually, let me go back for just a moment. So sometimes you don't actually have to identify a fallacy or identify a guiding virtue. Sometimes it'll work perfectly fine without doing that. So here's an example. And this is actually an example from a former client of mine. This client often beat himself up because of bad things that he'd done in the past. He would often guilt trip himself. You know, and even though it had been years since he'd done those things, he would still beat himself up. Right? And when I talked to him, he basically said that he beat himself up because he almost felt like he deserved to beat himself up. He deserved to suffer because of those things he'd done. And so in this case, the object of his guilt was that he did bad things, and the reaction was thinking that he deserves to suffer. Okay, so the rule in this case would be, if I did bad things, then I deserve to suffer forever. Because remember, he kept beating himself up forever, right? The report was, I did bad things, and the conclusion is, therefore, I deserve to suffer forever. Now, we could identify a fallacy in that reasoning, but we don't really have to. We could just refute a faulty step in the reasoning. For example, we could refute the rule. The rule says, if I did bad things, then I deserve to suffer forever. And when I was talking to him, I said, okay, suppose that someone commits a crime. Like, let's say they steal something. Do you want that person to be punished forever? Like for all eternity? And he said, no. And I said, why not? And he said, well, because the punishment should fit the crime, right? So in other words, the punishment should be proportional to the crime. And well, that shows this rule can't possibly be correct, because if you did bad things, then that doesn't mean you should suffer forever. You should only suffer as much as you deserve, right? Not forever. Okay. Now, we could go with step 4, but we can also just skip to step 5, adopt a philosophy to counteract the faulty step. So the rule again is, if I did bad things, then I deserve to suffer forever. And we saw that this rule is flawed. So what's a philosophical view or theory that you could adopt to counteract this rule, to act as an antidote to this rule? Well, in this case, it could be proportionality, right? The idea that the punishment should fit the crime. The punishment should be proportional to the crime. By adopting this philosophy, you can counteract this rule. Okay, so the idea is that whenever you find yourself thinking, oh, whenever you find yourself, beating yourself up over things you did in the past, you want to ask yourself, okay, have I already suffered enough? Do I still deserve to suffer? Or maybe have I suffered enough and beating myself up more would be disproportionate? And finally, make a plan of action. So in this case, if the philosophy is proportionality, then the plan might be, step 1, notice when you feel guilty about a past action. Step 2, ask yourself how much a stranger would deserve to suffer for that action. So I know you might beat yourself up forever because of it, but how much, like if it was some other person, a stranger, how much would you want them to suffer for that action? Then third, ask yourself whether you've already suffered that much because of your guilt, right? You've been beating yourself up all this time. Have you already suffered that amount? And step 4, if you have already suffered that amount, then tell yourself that you don't need to suffer anymore. Okay, so that's just, one example of a plan of action for putting this philosophical antidote into action. Okay, so before we get to the Q&A, I would like to see if anyone wants to volunteer to kind of so that I can walk through this process with them, kind of show you how it's done. Now, in order to volunteer, you need to have in mind a specific emotion that you struggle with. Now, it can be related to politics or not. That's up to you. The examples I've given so far haven't been related to politics. Your example can be political, or it doesn't have to be. And it needs to be something that you would be willing to discuss in front of an audience. I mean, normally, if I were to do LBT with a client, it would be 100% confidential, right? I'm not supposed to do this, in public, but for the purposes of this presentation, you'll be doing this in front of an audience. So, does anyone want to volunteer? Rich, are we getting any volunteers?
I like the socialism idea. But sorry, this is Brian.
Oh, Brian, hello. You like the stoicism, you mean?
Right, I didn't fully comprehend what you were saying, but the term caught my attention.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Go ahead.
So that would be somebody kind of festering in your thoughts or something? I don't know. Is it kind of my interpretation?
Oh, wait, sorry. What are you talking about stoicism?
Yeah, wanting to get displaced into something else or something.
Well,
Or
no,
am I-
no. Oh, okay. I think you must. So stoicism is a philosophy that says you should separate what you can control from what you can't.
I
And
got
you
you.
should
So
focus
still
only on the things you can control.
fallacy by guilty association, right? No, similar.
Um,
When you come to a conclusion, because this person is doing that, they are responsible for this. Is that it?
no, so that would be a fallacy. Actually, stoicism here is not supposed to be a fallacy. It's something you can use to counteract certain fallacies.
So stoicism was to be the logic reasoning.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway,
Not just separating what you can control from what you can't.
yes, yeah. So let's say that you tend to be a perfectionist and you tend to get really frustrated if things aren't perfect, right? Well, one thing you could do is separate in your mind, okay, what are the things I can control and what are the things I can't control? And then kind of train yourself to only worry about the things you can control. And that way you don't, yeah. So,
I would, as a janitor, I would control all my products and cleaning supplies, right?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
But if someone other than you makes a mess somewhere, right, it's not worth getting upset about this. So I'm now seeing some volunteers. So Jerry's raising his hand. Tomiko sent me a direct message with an idea for something to discuss. Cassandra says in the chat that there's some thoughts on this. So Tomiko got a message in first. I noticed you sent this as a direct message. Tomiko, do you want to actually discuss this out loud or not?
Sure, no problem.
Okay, Tomiko, so welcome. So you say that one emotion you struggle with is guilt about a divorce. Right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go back to our steps here. So the first step is to identify your emotional reason. Well, in your case, the emotion is guilt, and the object of that guilt, what the thing the guilt is about, is obviously the divorce, right? And how do you feel in response to the divorce? So you say you feel guilty, but did you feel certain ways about yourself? Do you feel certain ways about, how would you describe what you feel?
I feel the effects on my children.
And you feel, oh, so really, actually, I think the object is the effects of the divorce on your children. That's what you feel guilt about.
Yeah.
And does it make you feel, how does it make you feel when you look at those effects on your children?
I feel guilty still. Are you asking for the R?
Yeah. So what's your reaction? So you said you feel guilty. So do you, I mean, I suspect you don't feel that you're worthless, right? So how would you describe how you feel about yourself?
I feel I shouldn't have done it.
Okay. So
they're suffering for my divorce.
Okay. So you're kind of condemning yourself for kind of doing what you feel was bad for your children.
Right.
Okay. So the object is the effects of the divorce on your children, and the reaction is kind of self-blame or feeling that you've done something wrong.
Right, divorce is bad.
Well, okay. So in this case, your emotional reasoning would be, if my divorce had bad effects on my children, then I did something bad. Okay. The report is, my divorce had bad effects on my children, and the conclusion is, therefore, I did something bad. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to see if we can question either the rule or the report. Okay. Now, we could try to look for a fallacy that you're committing, but let's just look directly at the rule and the report and see if we can find a flaw. So the report is, my divorce had a bad effect on my children. Now, is that really true? So why do you think the divorce had a bad effect on your children?
They didn't have a male role model
Oh, okay.
growing up.
But has it actually, I mean, yes, it is good if children have a male role model, but have you actually noticed any bad effects on them as a result of the divorce? Like, did they end up having any behavioral problems or any?
Yes, two of them did. One of them did not, because she was only 2 years old when we divorced. So two of them had a bad result. One was extreme anger, and the other one was acting out.
Okay. Did they tell you that it was because of the divorce?
They didn't tell me that. No, I reasoned that. I gave the anger, I ascribed it to the divorce, and the acting out, I ascribed to the divorce.
Okay. Well, I would say that okay, so I'm a philosopher. I'm not actually like a marriage and family therapist or psychologist or anything.
Yeah.
So you would probably want to see someone like that to really decide whether it was really because of the divorce. I would say, though, that you might be a little too quick to assume that those problems your children had were because of the divorce. You know, I grew up with a very stable, pretty happy two-parent household. But I had massive depression throughout a lot of my youth. And so, as scientists sometimes say, post hoc ergo propter hoc is a fallacy. So in other words, just because one thing happens after another doesn't mean that the first caused the second, right? So just because your children had emotional issues after a divorce doesn't mean the divorce caused it, right? Plenty of people can have emotional problems without their parents getting divorced. So that's one thing I would say about the report. Now, as for the rule, if my divorce had a bad effect on my children, then I did something bad.
Yeah.
Well, why did you get divorced?
Domestic violence.
Okay. Do you think that being in an environment of domestic violence would be good for your kids?
No.
Okay, so there's obviously a problem with this rule, because you're saying if the divorce had a negative effect, then I did something bad. But who knows? I mean, it's quite possible that not getting the divorce would have had an even bigger negative effect, right?
Sure.
So especially if there was domestic violence in the picture. So I'd say it doesn't really make sense to that rule doesn't really make sense. Would you agree with me?
Yes, because I actually did something good about the reason for the divorce.
Oh, okay. What's that?
I left him.
Okay, good. Okay, yeah. So right there, I mean, if you were in a situation of domestic violence, then I think it's reasonable to suspect that it would have turned out even worse for the kids if you hadn't gotten out. So I think so you can't really say that you did something bad. Now, me just telling you that, of course, isn't going to automatically make the guilt go away, right? But by reminding yourself, whenever you start feeling guilty about this, by reminding yourself of your emotional reasoning, and then reminding yourself why the rule is flawed, that can kind of help diffuse the guilt, I think.
Yeah, because it really, when taking in all the accounts, the reason that it was a good thing that I got a divorce.
Yeah. So I think a plan of action for you. We can actually skip the guiding virtue and even the philosophy. I think a good plan of action for you would be to really be more empirical with your judgments. I mean, look at all the facts before making a judgment. So it seems like when you feel guilty about the divorce, you're looking at only some of the facts. You're looking at how the divorce might have negatively affected your kids, but you're not looking at other facts, like the fact that the domestic violence could have had a very negative effect on your kids as well.
True. And he was an angry man.
Yeah. Okay. So
There's quite a few reasons why if I didn't divorce, there's quite a few reasons why it was better to divorce.
Right. Yeah. So just think about that. Just think about that whenever you feel tempted to beat yourself up. Okay, now, so that's just a very quick model of how this works in real time. Does anyone have any questions? Like, so now I want to kind of, I know some other people have sent like actual emotional struggles that they have, but for now I want to open it up for Q&A. See if anyone has just any questions about LBT or about my claim, which is that progressives need to reclaim self-improvement. So does anyone have any questions? Okay, yeah, so as Richard said, if you raise your hand in the reactions menu, or you could just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, I have a little question. Sometimes, I mean, I recognize that I really wish my mother would have divorced my father much earlier than she did. We had to live with that man and suffer the abuse. Sometimes on the other hand, you do make a mistake. So how does that sort of play into it? Let's say that Tomiko had actually divorced for not very good reasons. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, sometimes you will get a client who actually, like, they have genuinely done something worth feeling bad about. But then it becomes a question of, is there something else wrong with their reasoning? So let's say that Tomiko had I don't know, let's make it even more extreme. Let's say that she well, we don't have to say Tomiko, but let's say that someone has kids with someone and then she doesn't like the responsibilities of parenthood, so she runs off. Okay, abandons the kids. Okay, and let's say that by now, years have passed, she has, and let's say she's actually done her best to try to reconcile with the kids, to let them know that she did something wrong, and to tell them that well, she would like to be part of their lives if they would have her. But let's say that despite doing those things, she still is racked with guilt over what she did. Well, in that case, I think we want to maybe look at at exactly how that person is condemning herself. So, like, remember my former client's emotional reasoning. If I did bad things, then I deserve to suffer forever. So let's say yes, she did something very bad in the past, something that is worth feeling guilty about. But at this point, it's already done. And she's done everything she can to make things right. There's no more that she can do. So there's really no point in her torturing herself anymore. But let's say she continues to torture herself because she feels like she just deserves to suffer. Well, in that case, her emotional reasoning would be something like this. And I would maybe question the rule here, say, well, again, if someone steals something, would you want them to suffer forever? Right. And that might help relieve some of the urge to just torture herself. Now it gets tricky because there are cases where someone might have done something bad and they still have things that they need to do to make amends. In order to achieve the kind of life or the kind of relationships that they want, they need to make some amends. Well, in that case, it might actually be useful for them to feel some guilt because that guilt might motivate them to do the right thing. And so I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that whenever you feel an unpleasant emotion, you should always try to get rid of it using this method, because it might turn out that the emotion is actually quite justified. I'm just saying that if you are really suffering from an emotion that's really interfering with your ability to live your life, then this is a way you can kind of try to get back on your feet. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, I have a Kimberly Weinstein in the chat. And if you do want to put your questions in the chat, apparently I'm able to monitor the chat.
Yes.
So do that too. So she says, how do you put this into play when, for example, you are staffing a booth and some angry conservative person cannot hear what you're saying because they're so angry and making assumptions? So can you use this technique to diffuse this situation?
Not this technique exactly, because this is not meant to be used on another person, like to fix them if they don't want to be fixed, right? This is something you'd use on someone who wants to be fixed. Now, something you could employ parts of this in dealing with, like, say, an angry conservative person who's just not listening to you or is very stuck in their views. You might, for example, be able to recognize some fallacy that they're committing, right? So, they might have a world revolves around me attitude where they think everyone needs to think the same way they do, or they might be oversimplifying reality, or they might be making blind conjectures. And in those cases, there might be ways you could encourage them to adopt the corresponding virtue. So if they're oversimplifying reality or making blind conjectures, you could, you probably don't want to tell them you need to be more objective, because that will just make them angry. But you could, if someone is just making irrational or unfounded claims, then you want to try to be the objective one, right? The worst thing you can do is kind of go to the opposite extreme and start making generalizations about conservatives and that sort of thing. So you want, if you're dealing with someone who's oversimplifying reality, you want to try as hard as possible to be the almost kind of like Spock-like objective person who is just kind of looking at the facts and presenting them in a kind of a non-combative way. Like, look, would you, well, if I told you XYZ, like, would that change your view? Or, something like that. So there are pieces of this that you can use when dealing with others, but I think this is more useful if, let's say that you are, you just got out of a conversation with an angry conservative guy, and let's say you're feeling really angry. You managed to hold it together during the conversation, but afterwards you're just really just upset. It makes you angry that there's someone out there who thinks that way. This is something you could use on yourself. One thing you might focus on is, okay, so I think if you're getting really upset that there's someone out there who has crazy views, I think you're probably engaging in the world revolves around me thinking, where, their views may genuinely be crazy and irrational, but insisting that everyone be as rational as you, or as rational as you think you are, is just unrealistic, right? You're just not going to find that in reality. And so one thing you could work on is being more empathic, trying to see how someone could come to think that way. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but just try to understand how they became like that. And actually understanding that might put you in a better position to change their mind, Okay, so yeah, so I hope that was helpful.
Yes.
Kellen says a lot of this feels more about adjusting your way of thinking to manage your emotions more logically, so then you can start acting more logically while still addressing your valid emotions. Yeah, I'd say that's true. So I think, I listed all 7 steps. I think really what's most useful in LBT, and this can kind of be your takeaway, is this step 1, identifying your emotional reasoning. So what's your emotion? What's the object? What are you feeling the emotion about? So like, for example, Jerry says, I feel threatened by the US Supreme Court justices. Okay, so the object would be the Supreme Court justices. And the reaction would be a feeling, a feeling of fear or of anxiety, right? Feeling that you are in danger or the country is in danger. Now, that could be a quite justified emotion, right? The problem only would come if you are, if it gets to the point where your anxiety is interfering with your life, right? You're just not able to live a normal life. Because look, if politicians, and let's be real, Supreme Court justices are politicians, even though they portray themselves as non-political, they are politicians. Like, the fact that politicians you don't like are in power is a reason for concern, right? It is a reason to be anxious. The problem only comes if the anxiety is interfering with your life. So let's say you're feeling like, if there are these Supreme Court justices, then I need to worry constantly, right? I can't let myself stop worrying, or that means I don't really care. And some people do kind of think that way. Then the report would be, there are these Supreme Court justices, and the conclusion would be, therefore, I need to worry all the time. Well, okay, so there's an obvious problem with that, and I'll tell you what it is. Okay, so the rule is, if there are these Supreme Court justices, or if, fill in the blank, if something bad is happening, then I need to worry all the time. Well, okay, either if something bad is going on, like with the Supreme Court justices, either there's something you can do about it, or there isn't. If there's something you can do about it, then do that, right? Instead of sitting around worrying, put your energy into actually doing something. If there's nothing you can do about the situation, then worrying is pointless, right? It's actually irrational to worry. So in a sense, I know this is easier said than done, but in a sense, worrying is never really a rational response. Okay, so Kimberly says, so how do you put this into play when, for example, you are staffing a booth? Okay, we already saw that. Okay.
Well, Galen seems to ask whether this is really only useful on yourself.
Yeah, I think it's okay, so I would not recommend that you try to go through these steps with someone else to help them unless you are a philosophical consultant, unless you've gotten the training. So I was more thinking of you using it on yourself. Many people get frustrated and upset and angry because of politics. And my thought was that this could be a way for people to help themselves diffuse their own negative emotions. I wasn't really thinking of this as something you would use on someone else. Now, I'm not saying that being familiar with LBT couldn't be helpful when dealing with others. But I wasn't really thinking that you would be using this on someone else. Okay.
Now, Rebecca says she feels futility over contacting her representatives in Congress and her senators because they're so biased against her point of view. So
Right.
How can she deal with that?
Okay. Well, so you feel futility. So you might, let's call that despair. Okay. So the emotion is despair. The object is that it's unlikely that your like letters or whatever will influence your representatives. Maybe because they have a different political ideology. Okay. And your response is to feel that it's useless. There's no point. Okay, so sorry. So in that case, the rule is if my representative is unlikely to be influenced by me, then it's useless to try to influence them. The report is I'm unlikely to influence my representative, and the conclusion is therefore it's useless to try to influence them. Okay, well, first of all, we might question the report. I'm not saying that you would your letter by itself is going to change your representative's vote. That's almost certainly not going to happen. But politicians, what they really care about is getting reelected, right? And so if enough people contact them and urge them to vote a certain way, that might influence them. And so your communication by itself probably isn't going to do anything, but as part of a bigger group, you can probably achieve something. Or even if even if a bunch of people urge the representative to vote a certain way and the representative doesn't end up doing it, still, I mean, let's maybe, I don't know, let's be real cynical and say maybe they're being paid off by lobbyists or something to vote a certain way. So all their constituents' messages aren't changing their vote. Well, still, now they know that a bunch of people want them to vote a certain way. So if the political winds change so that it then becomes maybe more advantageous to them to vote that way, then they won't have any hesitation about voting that way because they'll know that that's what their constituents want. So that's one way to look at it. Another way is, let's look at the rule. If I'm unlikely to influence my representative, then there's no point in trying. Well, you might ask yourself, okay, what, is that really true? And I guess that would depend on your personal values. I mean, because some people say that, there could be people, let's say Democrats living in a deep red state. They know that their vote isn't going to really do anything, but they still see value in voting because they see it as kind of their civic duty or something. So you might also question the rule. Okay, let's see, any other questions?
Not for me.
Brian, did you have a question?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, all right. So, let's see, something just came in. It says,
Yeah.
yeah, but at Joseph, more than 70% of even Democrats don't want Biden to run again. Yet he says he doesn't care and will run anyway.
Yeah, so, okay, so what you're pointing out is, well, even in cases where a bunch of people want something, it doesn't really seem to change the politician's mind. Okay, now that's true. I mean, an example I could give you is, did you know that you could fact check me on this? Like, seriously, fact check me. If you look at polling, not only a majority of Americans, but a majority of Republicans think we should raise taxes on the wealthy. Did you know that? Like, a majority of Republicans think that. And yet are the people in Congress, either Republicans or really Democrats for the most part, are they very likely to raise taxes on the wealthy? No. So I understand where you're coming from, that feeling of futility. But again, I would say it's only possible to make a difference if you get enough people on board. And you know, I assume many people here are activists. I mean, that's the job of activists. I'm actually not much of an activist myself, but that's a job of activists, to try to get people on your side. You may not, through like writing letters to your senator or whatever, be able to change anything, but by trying to get your message out there, you might change some minds. And if enough people do that and enough people change minds, then and you get enough people who are really who are on your side, then as a group, it could be possible to make change, either by electing new people or, you know, through some other means.
Okay.
Oh, how is 70% not enough? Yeah, okay. So, and this goes to, you know, a good example would be, another example would be the one I gave, where I said even a majority of Republicans want to raise taxes on the wealthy. Yeah, and you do sometimes wonder, how is that not enough? Well, I'll tell you, I mean, why it doesn't always work out. It's because we vote on, we vote for representatives. We don't actually vote on policies. The representatives vote on policies. And so what we end up having to do is vote for the representatives we like best. And even if those representatives get in, they may not agree with us on everything. And so, and they might not even agree with us in cases where, you know, 70% or whatever of the people agree with us. And that's an unfortunate feature of representative democracy. I don't know how to fix it. Frankly, I think maybe, well, this is kind of getting off topic, but I think maybe it would be good if we had something like ranked choice voting, instead of the winner take all system that we currently have. Personally, I think just reforming the voting system is the only way we'll fix those problems. But again, in order to do that, in order to reform the voting system, you need to get people on board who are going to be on your side on that issue. And so it's still worthwhile to speak out. You might not change your elected representatives, but you might change other people's minds. And by changing other people's minds, you might help to change the system.
Okay, very good. So let's see. Do you see any other questions in the chat? I was wondering, I would like to make a couple announcements before we close up. Did you want to do a conclusion, Joe?
Yeah. No, not really. I mean, I think I've said everything I want to say. I mean, okay, one thing I will say, I think I want this talk to be as practical and as useful as possible to you. So if I were to leave you with one thing, I would leave you with the current slide that I'm on. Just step one, where you identify the emotion you're struggling with, the object, the reaction, you construct your emotional reasoning. And then what's so useful about that is even forgetting about the other steps, just see if you can find a flaw in that emotional reason. Usually it isn't that hard, right? Like with Tomiko, we saw, there was an obvious problem with her assumption that getting divorced must have been bad, right? And once we laid out the emotional reasoning, it was very easy to see that. So I would leave you with this slide. This is something you can do on your own to deal with your own emotional struggles. And I wish you all the best of luck. I hope you're able to improve your lives with this.
All right, thank you, Joseph. I wanted to make a couple announcements and then just remind you about and Stephanie, if you're here, if you want to talk about Whittier term limits, you can go ahead and unmute and just give us an update on what's happening if you want to do that. I put in the chat some links to our upcoming events, the Whittier Planning Committee meeting for our Jan 6th event, and to do events on Jan 6th around the country. And then also our nonpartisan Red Pill Men's Group. You can register for that at tinyurl.com/redpillmen, and you can register for the planning committee meeting at tinyurl.com/Jan 6, 2024. Stephanie, did you want to make any announcement or anything like that? Well, I guess not. So, all right. So, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for participating today. Thank you, Joseph, for preparing this wonderful talk. And
welcome.
Yeah, and make sure to click those links. You can and you can save the chat if you want. If you know how to do that. And we'll see you next week, because next week is our planning committee meeting. And then next month on the 6th is our next nonpartisan Red Pill Men's Group. And women are welcome to come to that group as well. So we'll all see you then. And thank you for coming. All right. Bye, everybody.